Greetings, traveler. A traveler called Low Level Static recently asked, I wonder how you might balance abilities with resource consumption in and out of combat. I'm envisioning classes that vary, such as warrior or archer, might rely on damage from basic attacks that don't consume resources. A wizard might have stronger attacks, but they deplete magic points that are recovered between battles. On the other hand, the mage's abilities are level-based and don't require purchasing, while the warrior has to upgrade his gear. Would money or some other resource that is depleted outside of combat work in such a balancing scheme? So basically, this question is about balancing abilities that require resources or perhaps money or other items to fuel their usage versus abilities that don't. And how does that affect the in-combat situation and recovery of these abilities and the out-of-combat situation? This is an excellent question. It's certainly a question that comes up extremely often when we're doing game design. And it's a very easy question loop to fall into, because when we're playing games as gamers, we don't usually think about the design, right? We see all the different abilities that are available in the game, and we're simply comparing them and seeing which one is most useful to us. So we don't think about how much money they require to purchase, or like what other resources are required, and are they finite or are they combat related, and so on. So today what I want to do is show you my very simple framework for tackling this type of situation. I want to show you what the difficulty of this situation is from a design perspective, what the hard mode of dealing with it is, and then I'm going to explain how you can essentially navigate this situation without ever having to stress about what the right value is, what the right way to do it is, and come up with a result that is satisfying to you and of course to the players. So let's jump right in. My name is Xanthos. I've been working in the games industry for over 13 years now. I've worked on PC games, console games. I've worked on my own time on lots of tabletop games. So this type of question is extremely common. We want to show to our players as many interesting abilities as possible, but at the same time, we're having a hard time balancing all these abilities with each other and with the player's time and effort once they're all in the game. So what type of situation are we considering here? Well, imagine that, as low-level static asked, one class can spam out all its abilities all day long with virtually no cost, while other classes have to consume resources to use their abilities, presumably because they're of higher effect. And not only that, perhaps they are also limited in how many times per day or per battle and so on they can be used. So how can you balance something that's infinite and limitless against something that is not? Well, the difficult way, rather the hard mode of dealing with this, is trying to imagine that there is a correct way to deal with this. And of course, in game design, there's no one correct way, right? Anybody can come up with their own strategy for how to deal with these things. They can come up with a power level scheme that is well suited to the game. So imagine, for example, a superhero game where all the characters are extremely powerful versus a very realistic medieval combat game where the main character might be expected to be very weak in the beginning and very slowly build up his strength. So there's no one approach to this, that's for sure. But when we imagine that there is a correct answer for this, then everything starts to become solid in game design. All the abilities start having very strict values, and this should be good and that should be good, and all the abilities should feel good to use. And we end up in a weird situation where we're trying to balance essentially apples to oranges. So even though things are not the same, we're trying to balance them as if they were the same. But what's missing in this situation is having some common denominator to evaluate everything by. So I'm going to explain with a concrete example in a moment what I mean by this. But basically what we want to do in this situation is avoid basically trying to think that there is this one method, this one correct way of doing it, and anything else would be incorrect. So let's jump into an example and see what a more easy, more relaxed and sane way is to deal with the situation, something that has helped me a lot in the past, to balance both abilities that require resources and ones that don't. And even taking it a step beyond that, what if we're also talking about money and gems and shards and all these other resources in the game? How would that balance our overall ability equation? So first, the most important thing to understand about this method is that we decide first what we want to happen. So before we jump in and say, this is how strong basic attacks should be, and this is how strong magic spells should be, and so on, there's no should. There is what we want. If we want to emphasize magic in a game, we will make it stronger. If we want to emphasize that magic is not so important and physical sword skills, for example, are more important, we will amplify that, and so on. So I really want to stress the point that there is no correct way and there is no standard way of doing this. It is up to us as designers to decide what we want to happen in the game and conjure and craft an experience that lives up to that decision. And that decision is, up to us to shape as we like. So with that in mind, it is assumed that, or rather, I assume for this situation, for this question, that let's say the fighter can use their sword swings an infinite number of times per day, or a wizard can use his staff smack every time, as many times as he wants in a day, while if he wants to use magic spells, he has only a limited amount of times where he can use these spells. And to make things even more interesting, even more difficult for us as designers, let's also say that he also has to pay some physical cost every time he casts a spell. So if we're taking inspiration from Dungeons and Dragons, something like every time you cast a spell, you have to crush a gem or like sacrifice some money to some god or something. So let's add a hard physical cost as well. And also I want to add a third type of ability, one that is so powerful that you can only use it once in a while. So it's even more powerful than a spell, then of course more powerful than a normal physical attack. And that, for many designers, certainly for myself when I was earlier on in my career, that was a huge headache because, if an ability is so powerful, why do you need everything else? And if you're going to limit its usage, how much do you want to limit this usage by? So let's see a concrete example to put a framework around all this. So here I have a bunch of abilities, the times that's possible to use them, and also the cost that each ability requires. So for the basic attack, you can use it as many times as you want, but the cost is that you have to purchase gear. So you need a good sword, and you need a good staff or good armor or whatever to make this type of ability effective. For spells, you can only use them for 3 times per battle each. So if you have 10 spells, then you can use each of them 3 times in any single battle, and then you can recharge them and reuse them again in the next battle. But every time you use a spell, you also spend some money. So there's a material component cost to every spell as well. Finally, we assume that the player has some ancient bloodline skill that's super cool and super unique about this character. It's so strong that you can only use it once per day, but it has no cost. It doesn't need any gems or anything else to use it. He just uses it. So how on earth would we go about balancing all this to make sure it's presented to the player in a sane way? Well, as we said in the beginning, we have to decide what we want to happen. So let's say for this example, what we want to happen is that the player relies on the basic attack for most enemies. So most of the enemies in the game, they're weak, they don't need a super duper spell to be defeated. So a normal attack is enough to defeat them. The cost for this is buying some gear, but it's a one-time purchase, and then you can use it basically for as long as you want until you decide to upgrade. Now for spells, the situation is different because spells are limited. And just by going by real-world knowledge, resources that are limited are seen by humans as more desirable and more valuable. So as soon as we show the player that this you can do as much as you want, but spells you can only do so much, the player instinctively understands that if there's a limit on this, it has to be more valuable, it has to be better, otherwise there wouldn't be a limit. So this is just normal basic human knowledge. And as we said, we need to pay money for it, for every spell we cast. Now, of course, the money we pay here is probably not as much per spell as the cost of the gear. The gear is assumed to be more expensive overall, but once you have it, you use it forever. So that's one consideration. Finally, for the Ancient Bloodline skill, since it's 1 per day, as soon as a player sees this, they think, well, the spells are 3 times per day, or per battle rather, so you can use them way more often, you have way more of them, and yeah, they require a cost, but the cost is less than, let's say, buying a sword or buying a suit of armor. So these spells must be weaker than this Ancient Bloodline skill. Because it's much more limited, we instinctively communicate to the player that it must be better, it must be more valuable, it must be more powerful. So here is where we put in effect what we want to happen in this kind of scenario. So for this scenario, I assume that what I want to happen is I want the player to use the basic attack for most enemies. So little goblins, rats, whatever small enemies in the game, those can be defeated by normal attacks. The player doesn't need to use his bigger abilities for those. For spells, since they're limited but still quite numerous, I want the player to strategize their usage. And by strategize, I mean balance how he wants to use his limited resources against all the possibilities that are possible to use these spells in one battle. So let's say you fight 10 battles in a day. How you use the spells over these 10 battles is your strategy for using them. So the idea here is I want the player to save the spells for enemies that can only be defeated by them, or for situations where using a spell would be way, way more impactful than using a basic attack. And this is probably a good point to talk about impact in the framework of balance. So when we're trying to balance things, essentially what we're trying to do is to make sure that each of the abilities available in the game feels impactful. So for the basic attack, if our basic attack did 0 damage to the enemy, that would not feel impactful. Players would likely complain that it's not properly balanced. Conversely, if the basic attack did way more damage than everything else, then players would think, well, why would I use anything else since this is much better? So having a situation where each ability has the proportional impact for its looks, for what it's presented to be in the game, is generally what we consider a balanced game in this scenario. So when we're trying to make it impactful, if the spells do exactly the same damage as the basic attacks, they don't feel more impactful than the basic attacks. They feel just as impactful, but they're also limited and they cost money every time. So the player thinks, well, why would I use those? So to make them more impactful, we need to say something like, with one basic attack, I can kill, let's say, 1 enemy, but if I use a spell, I can kill 10 enemies at once. That definitely communicates the impact of the spells to the player, because the effect is greater and he feels the impact. He feels the difference in results between the two. So Finally, for this bloodline skill, there's multiple ways you could go about this. Again, there's nothing set about what we put in our games and how we channel it. So here you could go either the direction of you want the player to use this bloodline skill when he's tapped out of resources. So maybe he has no more money to spend on spells, or he already used all his spells, and there's this enemy that suddenly popped up and the player is not prepared for. So the player could be saving this skill for an emergency. Or you could say that, look, there's certain enemies that can only be defeated by this super duper skill. So I expect the player, I want the player to use this skill in that scenario against those enemies that are only vulnerable against this. And again, there's no right and wrong with this. You decide what is your preferred use for this ability, for this skill rather, for the player. So the players playing the game, all they're doing is they're trying to learn what is impactful and what isn't for the given character in the given situation. So here we're trying to teach this type of usage style so that most enemies should be defeated with the basic attacks. The more powerful ones or the more numerous ones should be defeated by spells, and the really, really strong ones, or the ones that jump at us and surprise us, should be defeated by this very powerful skill. If this is what we want to achieve, then our job balancing it is very, very straightforward. So because we ranked these abilities in the order that we want them to achieve their power, so by the effect we expect them to have, it's easy to imagine that, for example, if the basic attacks do 1 damage, then the spells should do something like, I don't know, 3 damage or 5 damage to show that they're more impactful. Or they do 1 damage to a group of enemies instead of a single enemy to show that they're different and they're more impactful since they're more expensive. And for the ancient skill, let's say it either does 10 damage or 20 damage or 100 damage even, to show that, look, if you use this skill, you can defeat anything, but you only have 1 of it per day, so use it wisely. If that's what we want to communicate, that's how we should set its attack value. Or perhaps it does something like this ancient skill, let's say it freezes time for 1 minute or for 3 rounds or whatever this game is supposed to be using. And in that time, you have time to not just use your basic attacks more, but you don't get attacked by the enemies. So you have some time to breathe and to come up with your strategy and create this big advantage against the enemies. So this basically covers the power of these abilities in relationship to each other for the given scenario we said. Again, if the scenario is different, this can all be very, very different itself, but let's stick with this for now. So then let's talk a little bit about cost. So here you need the one-time gear cost, here you need the every time money cost, and here there's no cost. So how do we balance all that? How do we make sure that money is impactful and relevant to combat, since money is typically something you use outside of combat? Well, here, so unsurprisingly, the approach we take is exactly the same. And again, you can think about this in many ways, but something that has helped me a lot is treating money or gems or shards or diamonds or whatever other physical resources in the game in exactly the same way. So you ask yourself, what do I want to happen when the player uses money? So in other words, when the player uses money well, or masters the usage of money in the game, what do I expect to happen? So if the player uses money too much on spells, for example, then perhaps he doesn't have enough money to buy better gear and he starts relying more on spells. Or if the player, wastes all his money on some, gacha mechanic in the game that is basically a money sink, then if he limits his usage and if he's clever about the way he uses his money in that mechanic, perhaps he'll get a benefit. But if he uses all of his money in this obvious money sink mechanic, then perhaps he will not have enough money to buy gear or to use money on spells. So this is entirely your decision as the game designer. And once you make that decision, once you say that this is what I expect happens with money in the game, then the task is to go back into the game and see if the game behaves according to the decision that you made. So that would mean in our case that if the player uses money wisely, then he should have enough money to buy a competent set of gear and have enough money for spells, assuming he doesn't use spells at every given opportunity. And he should have some money left over to feel like he has some purchasing power if some good opportunity to buy something good comes up. So practically, how would that work? Let's say you choose a given encounter for the game, and this encounter with enemies comes up, let's say 30 minutes into playing the game. So for those first 30 minutes, you, of course, as a game designer, control completely how much money is available to the player to accumulate. So let's say it's 100 gold pieces. So there, you already have a margin for how things can work out for the player. So from that 100 gold pieces, assuming that the player collected all the loot and searched all the crates and looked for secrets and so on, then the player is expected to have enough money to buy the most up-to-date set of gear and have enough money for spells, assuming that he moderates their usage. But of course, we cannot control what the player does in the game. The player needs some freedom to feel agentic, to feel that his decisions can be made into actions that impact the game world. That's what I mean by agentic. So another possibility for the player to use that 100 gold pieces is to say that, look, I don't really care about gear since spells seem to be so much more effective. I'll go without buying good gear and I'll just use my spells and I'll make up for my lack of gear with my mastery of the spell system. So if that's something that you want to be possible for the player to do, then the game rules must support it. So when you do test gameplays of the game yourself up to those first 30 minutes, you will likely want to check that if the player doesn't want to use any gear and just use spells, then it's possible to have enough money to play that way. But if you don't want this to be possible, you don't want the player to be able to solely rely on spells, and you want to show that, look, this character, he's just learning spells right now, he's not a master wizard. At this point in his development, he has to rely on his physical attacks as well. He has to show his mastery not just of magic, but of battle as well, by balancing the two to get the best of both worlds, essentially. The free melee attacks and the more expensive, more limited spells. So that is how you can set the expectation for the game and for each battle. And that is also how you can test it specifically. You give yourself the 100 gold pieces and you make sure that when you do your test gameplay of the game, that you had enough money to do everything that you say is possible for the player. So both buy an up-to-date set of gear and have enough money to spend on the spells. And assuming he used the money wisely, he should have, I don't know, like 20 or 30 gold pieces left over for emergencies in case a few enemies pop up and he needs to cast some emergency spells, or coming up to the next battle, which could be 40 minutes into the game, then because he has that extra leftover money, then you choose to reward him by offering him a weapon upgrade that can only be purchased if he saved up enough money up to this moment in the game. So this is a possible way to reward the player. And again, this is entirely your decision to choose what types of rewards there are in the game and how to make the player feel good for mastering the game system that you have set out before him. So Anyway, I think this about covers this framework and this approach towards resources. So basically, if I were to put it in just a couple of sentences, I would say that it doesn't really matter how many resources there are in the game and whether they're used in combat or out of combat or both. The only real question to the designer, at least when I'm thinking about how I design games myself, is be very, very conscious and very, very clear about what my expectation is for what happens in the game. Try to resist as much as possible following what other games do or doing something because another game did it and so on. That kind of stuff is good to get initial inspiration and to like see what's out there. But when I'm sitting down to think about how I design a specific part of a game, I cannot just copy something that exists in another game. I need to be very conscious about what I put in the game, what purpose it serves, and what I expect the player to be able to do, assuming he masters the rules of the game. And of course, if the player does master the rules of the game, then he is expected to do really, really well in the game, achieve victories, get rewards, get praise from the game, and all this good stuff. So whether the resource is usage per day or per battle of spells and abilities, or it's receiving a number of gems from the game and choosing how to use them, or receiving money over time in the game and choosing how to use them, or the player spending the extra effort to, let's say, look into this extra secret tunnel and gather a bit more money that he found in the tunnel. Gathering the money itself is not really the reward. The reward is being able to use later on that money to get an extra reward for himself, or to unlock an extra option, or to unlock content, or see a nice cutscene. One of these like types of rewards, or anything you can think about, is a way to reward the player for taking the extra time and effort to gather that extra money and to make it feel impactful. So, which I think is the whole point why we engage in this game balance exercise. So anyway, that's it for today. I hope this shed some light in the crazy question of balancing all these different resources in the game. I hope this is useful for you. Thank you so much for your time. And as always, have fun.